Morning, everyone, and welcome to today's call to discuss the Washington State Western Energy Imbalance Market Greenhouse Gas Enhancements Draft Final Proposal. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by Anya Gilbert from our policy development team here at the Kaiso. Before we get started, I have just a couple housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you need technical assistance at any time during today's call, please send a chat to our event producer. Her name is Michelle. The agenda for today, in just a second, I'm going to hand it over to Anya and we'll dive into the content of the draft final proposal, and then we'll leave some time here at the end for some Q&A and wrap up with some next steps. So here on this slide is our Kaiso Policy Initiative stakeholder process. We are here under the proposal development phase at the draft final proposal. We are targeting an October 25th through 26th Board of Governors meeting with implementation in early 2023. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anya and she will kick us off.
Great. Thanks, Isabella. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for tuning in bright and early. I also want to acknowledge and thank our Washington partners for joining us this morning. We have Commissioner Ann Randell from the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission, and Bill Drumheller from the Department of Ecology, and we also expect to be joined by Glenn Blackman from the Department of Commerce. So thanks again for joining. Let me start by framing the purpose of the initiative, which is really to support the Washington Western Energy Imbalance Market entities with their required reporting of emissions to the Department of Ecology, starting with emissions year 2022. And as many of you on this call are aware, both Washington's Cap and Invest program and reporting rules will continue to evolve. And as that evolution occurs, the Kaiso will continue to engage with you all as stakeholders so that those changes can be reflected in our market. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So this slide uses the same framework we shared in the issue paper and straw proposal of the enhancements, which shows if and where the proposal has changed before we get into the details later. So first, previously we had proposed to associate generation and load for reporting purposes. We are no longer proposing this as we recognize, in light of stakeholder comments, that to implement this change would move ahead of Washington regulations. Second, as in our last proposal and in this draft final proposal, we are keeping the enhancement to reflect greenhouse gas reference levels. And in light of the fact that an allowance auction will not occur ahead of 2023, we are proposing an interim approach to use a price ahead of that allowance auction. And lastly, we'll be continuing to support reporting. So let's move to the next slide. Next, in light of stakeholder comments, I wanted to also spend some time on what is not included in the proposal and not a part of any of the enhancements. So currently, the greenhouse gas enhancements do not allow outside entities to reflect their cost of carbon as a specific compliance identity hasn't been identified in the regulations. And this matters because who the compliance entity is impacts how we would model and settle the cost of greenhouse gas emissions. And just to illustrate kind of two bookend approaches, I just want to walk through these examples to show the impact. And so with this first example, example one, I'm showing one end of the spectrum where if the compliance entity was the Washington Western Energy Imbalance Participating Resource Scheduling Coordinator, we could model the cost of greenhouse gas compliance with the resource. And any attributed resource in a non-greenhouse gas zone would receive a greenhouse gas payment, but they would also carry the associated compliance and reporting obligations. In contrast, in the second example, I'm showing the other end of the spectrum, where if the compliance entity was load, you could set up a very different market design in which maybe the resource bids overcome a toll, and that toll is paid for by the greenhouse gas region load. greenhouse gas region load could also take on the reporting and compliance obligations. So this slide is really just for illustrative purposes and is only meant to convey that without the specifics of a compliance entity identified, we don't have enough information on the Kaiso side to dictate how to reflect the cost of carbon compliance in the market. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So as a follow-up to the previous slide, this slide is intended to highlight that without that compliance entity identified and without a means for outside resources to reflect their greenhouse gas costs to Washington, there's going to be an asymmetric treatment of resources in Washington that are reflecting their cost to greenhouse gas compliance in the bid, and those resources outside Washington that do not. So in short, resources in a greenhouse gas region with a greenhouse gas compliance cost will be comparatively more expensive than a similarly situated resource outside of Washington. And this table below highlights, through an example, two similarly situated natural gas resources in and out of a greenhouse gas region that both have an energy bid of $40. However, in the greenhouse gas region, they're reflecting a greenhouse gas cost of compliance of $10, and outside of that region, it's not applicable. And this results in the total bid in the greenhouse gas region of $50 and outside of the region of $40. So this is the state of the world, as Washington's program is implemented, but as rules develop in Washington through their Cap and Invest program and reporting rules, we will continue to work with stakeholders to reflect those changes in our market. So let me pause here and see if there's any questions before we move into the details of what we're proposing in the draft final proposal.
So if you connected to audio through the WebEx, you can raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon located to the right above the chat window. If you joined audio separately, then you'll need to press #2 to enter the queue.
I do have a question. Caller, your line's unmuted. Please go ahead.
So this is Jeremy Weinstein asking, you indicated that there wasn't an allowance price for Washington yet, and you were going to use a proxy. Is that something you're going to discuss later in the slides? Because I don't want to get ahead of the story if you're going to get to that.
We'll get to that in about 2 slides. So.
Okay.
And we do have a phone-only caller with a question. Caller, your line's unmuted. Please go ahead. Caller, your line's unmuted. Please go ahead. All right. They must be having trouble with audio. Let me go and close that. And I see no further questions.
All right, great. Well, let's move to the next. Thank you. So as I mentioned earlier in the proposal summary, we're not associating generation or load with Washington. Is that the caller coming through?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, we're not planning on associating generation or load with Washington for the sole purposes of enhancing reporting in 2023. This enhancement was originally proposed for more accurate reporting. However, stakeholders and comments raised some use cases that render this enhancement less accurate and may require additional clarification from the Washington Department of Ecology in their rulemaking. And so as a result of this stakeholder feedback, the initiative no longer includes the enhancement as to not move ahead of the Department of Ecology's rulemaking. Let's move to the next slide. So this initiative still plans to update the Washington greenhouse gas cost reference levels. Reference levels collectively refer to the costs we use to mitigate resources if they have market power or the default energy bids, and the cost used to commit resources, also known as commitment costs. So default energy bids, or DEBs, are used in local power mitigation process, specifically in situations where a participant might have the ability to exercise market power. The Kaiso may adjust the resource's submitted energy bid downward to the higher of either their default energy bid or the competitive LNP. We do have various default energy bid options, and the calculations would apply to the variable cost option, default energy bid. For default commitment costs, these really serve as the cap on bids that scheduling coordinators can submit when they're reflecting their minimum load cost bids, their startup bids, or their transition cost bids. And the Kaiso's market process uses these bids to determine whether to commit the resources or not. So this calculation would apply to both the default commitment cost for the proxy cost and registered cost methodologies. Let's move to the next slide. I want to emphasize that the greenhouse gas costs are just one part of the DEB or commitment cost, and reflecting greenhouse gas costs in the reference levels will follow a similar approach that we use in California today. But for resources that are registered with the Washington Department of Ecology as having the greenhouse gas compliance obligation, the Kaiso will estimate the cost of Washington allowances and calculate a resource-specific cost adder. And to estimate that price, we plan to use index prices from external vendors. However, as I mentioned earlier, as a first auction doesn't occur until after the start of 2023, we plan to start with a fixed estimate of that allowance cost. So let's move to the next slide. We have included a proposed phasing of the greenhouse gas reference levels, and the timing of these will really be dependent on the information available and the implementation timelines. So to start, at January 1st, 2023, we would plan to use the estimate that's been published by a consultant to the Department of Ecology, Vivid Economics. And we plan to use their cost estimate of $41 per metric ton of CO2e. And the assumption with that cost estimate was that California and Washington would link in the future. And that is reflected in Washington's regulations and in the legislature. And we believe that this estimate is reasonable in terms of the wider market's expectations about the cost of compliance. We won't stay with this $41 in perpetuity. Instead, when the allowance auction occurs, we plan to use that allowance auction price as a more accurate reflection of allowance prices. And when index prices are available from external vendors, we would then use those as a more dynamic reflection of the allowance price. Let me pause here and see if there's any questions on this approach. Otherwise, I have one more slide on the greenhouse gas cost adders. I'm not seeing any questions pop up, so let's move to the next slide. All right, so the greenhouse gas cost adder that I just described would then apply to both the variable cost option default energy bid and the default commitment cost calculations. For the variable default energy bid, the calculation is really a product of that resource's incremental heat rate, the greenhouse gas rate authorized by the Department of Ecology, and the applicable greenhouse gas allowance price. This is then added to other components of the default energy bid, fuel costs, variable O&M costs, to arrive at a final value. And the default commitment cost would have a similar greenhouse gas cost adder. Let me pause here and see if there are any questions. I see a comment from Anne Randall. Could we unmute her line?
Sure.
The Commissioner's line.
Good morning, Anya, and thank you for the presentation. As I've been thinking about this, as Kaiso has gone through this process, and having reviewed the proposal, I'm concerned about, because Department of Ecology's rules are not available yet, but soon, the timing between having Kaiso develop this proposal and understanding what some of the details are in ecology's rule will create a disadvantage within the state of Washington. And I'm wondering if you can explain whether it's necessary to do this now, and given the uncertainties, what is the harm in not going forward with this until we have all the details from the Department of Ecology's rules?
Sure. So this was really intended to reflect kind of the requirements of ecology for reporting purposes and the assumption that Washington resources are reflecting their cost of compliance as a result of those regulations. So I might ask Bill Drumheller with ecology, his reactions to your comments in terms of some of the timing.
Okay, looks like we do have another question.
Hi, this is Jeremy Weinstein. So I thank you very much for this presentation. It's really helpful information. There was something on one of the slides that I just wanted to note for you. In one of the slides, it indicated that there's no impact or GHG compliance cost on jurisdictions that don't have a GHG cap. So one jurisdiction that has a cap is Washington, one jurisdiction that has a cap is California, and one jurisdiction that doesn't currently have a cap is Oregon. And so there's a market hub that's in Washington that is used to serve California and Oregon. In like a third stays in Washington, but 2/3 leaves for Oregon and California destinations in terms of the energy. And so currently, that market hub price, as currently constituted, reflects the uncertainty of whether or not a buyer at that hub is going to sink the energy in Washington or outside of Washington. And right now, Washington is not linked to California, so sink it in California. And so a seller doesn't know if it's a first jurisdictional deliverer and whether or not it's going to incur an allowance cost. And since the risk of a seller incurring an allowance cost is unknown to the seller is going to say, well, I have to charge my buyer for that risk, not necessarily the cost of allowances, but for the risk of allowances. And so that is, in fact, a cost that does now leak through to Oregon, which is not capped, into California, which has an unlinked cap. So I'm just making a kind of a technical note for you that I think when evaluating your assumptions, it's important to know that this cost isn't isolated in Washington. It is indeed a cost that comes through to California and Washington because the market is currently constituted. Now, there's an industry organization called the Western Systems Power Pool, WSPP, which is seeking to try to come up with market contract solutions in order to mitigate that harm of that extra cost. But I just wanted to note for assumptions that are made in the slide, I think it's important to note that that cost is not isolated in the jurisdiction that is imposing the cap.
If you could elaborate on that in comments, that would be helpful. But thank you for that context.
Thank you. Thank you for a great presentation.
Okay, we do have another question. Caller, please go ahead. Go ahead, you're unmuted. All right, seems to be having some sound issues at this time. I see no other questions at the moment.
It looks like, Bill, you might be double muted. could we unmute Bill Drumheller's line? It looks like he was in the queue.
Yep, his line is unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
All right. Yes, thanks, Bill.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. I guess at this point, it seems like I was triple muted, which is appropriate at this time of the morning. Yeah, so Commissioner Rendell, thanks for that question. I think one point or one piece of information that's important in terms of timing, I think, to understand is, again, as Anya mentioned, we're really talking about two different programs here. We're talking about the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program and, of course, the Cap and Invest program, which most people are focused on. However, for the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, Washington is, for those who don't know, for the first time bringing in electricity into the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, and also bringing in requirements for reporting, which is what this initiative is largely focused on. And the timing of those requirements are essentially that the electric power entities, EPEs, are going to be required to report EIM transactions as part of that reporting. That in order for that, and that'll happen in June of 2023. But in order for that to happen, the department needs to develop the tools, the protocols, tools, and methodologies to make that happen. To develop those tools and methodologies, we of course need to understand the data, which reasonably can be reported by those entities. So really, the first part of all of this is getting an understanding of and putting in place those tools. And we are, as I think many of the folks on this call have been urging the department to develop those tools as rapidly as possible. And so we are, there's obviously an urgency around the Cap and Invest program, but also in the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, there's very much an urgency to understand those data and put in place the infrastructure so that we can we can move forward on reporting of EIM data through that reporting program, which ultimately will be used to support the Cap and Invest program. Thank you.
Let's move to Anne in case she has any follow-up comments to Bill's comments there.
No, thank you. I appreciate the comments. I just, having reviewed the draft proposal, and I'm hearing concerns, and I have some concerns about the short-term impact for Washington. And Jeremy has raised the issue about the mid-sea contract uncertainty. So it's a time of uncertainty, and just so raise the question of, is it necessary to do this now until we have more information? But it sounds like that is needs to be done. So it's just expressing just some concern and potential cost to ratepayers at a time when it's not a good time. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Looks like we did have one more hand raised in the queue.
Hi, Anya. It's Claire Breidnich with Western Power Trading Forum. I just wanted to respond to the issue raised by Commissioner Rendell and the comment provided by Bill Drumheller. I guess I would say I completely understand Commissioner's concern. The Washington program will impact Washington generators unfairly compared to other generators in the EIM because of the Cap and Invest program. Washington generators will have a compliance obligation to the extent that they are emitting resources, and the Kaiso is not doing that. That's created by the Cap and Invest program. The disparity, the unfairness, comes from the fact that Ecology has not put a similar requirement on imports of the EIM via the energy imbalance market. Maybe the regulation, when we'll see it, will have that compliance obligation that will levelize the playing field for Washington resources. But with respect to what you're doing here in terms of including greenhouse gas costs in the default bids, I think is appropriate. It's something that resources on their own, resource scheduling coordinators will have to bid to cover their greenhouse gas compliance costs or their estimated costs. You're just kind of filling in the blanks here that where you don't have those bids, you're able to come up with an approximate number to help ensure that those resources, to the extent they are dispatched, will actually recoup their costs. So just want to say that I do agree with Ann Rendell that there is disparity here, that there will be impacts on Washington resources, but that is not due to something the Kaiso is doing. It's due to this unequal treatment in the cap and invest regulation.
Thank you, Claire. I don't see any more hands raised.
There are no more questions in the queue.
All right, well, let's move. Okay, the last enhancement is really around reporting. So under its reporting rules, the Department of Ecology is planning on treating all transactions in the WEIM used to serve load within Washington as imported energy subject to a default emissions rate. And the Kaiso plans, in order to support reporting, to calculate market dispatches based on instructed imbalanced energy on an annual basis for WEIM entities to meet the reporting requirements to the Department of Ecology. And I'll flag that real-time instructed imbalanced energy reflects the WEIM transactions used to serve electricity demand. Let's move to the next slide. From a governance perspective, the initiative has joint authority between Kaiso's Board of Governors and the Western Energy and Balance Board of Governors, as the initiative proposes to update Washington reference levels to reflect Washington greenhouse gas compliance costs and develop reports for Washington Western Energy and Balance entities to support their reporting to ecology. It's also under both of their purview, as some WEIM balancing authorities are subject to these enhancements. And we encourage you to submit response to this classification if you do have any feedback. With that, I'll open it up to some remaining time for Q&A.
Okay, we do have a few hands raised in the queue. Please go ahead.
Hi, Anya, it's Claire again. Can we go back to slide 14? So I want to comment on your background. WPTF raised this in the comment, in our comments. You've asserted in several places that the Washington Department of Ecology will treat all transactions in the EIM used to serve load within Washington as imported energy subject to a default emission rate. I disagree with that, and I would really like to know on what basis you're making that interpretation, or on what basis ecology is making that interpretation, because the regulation clearly says that imported electricity means electricity generated outside of Washington state with a final point of delivery within Washington state. So that does not mean that energy that was generated within Washington and is purchased by another EIM entity through the EIM is in fact an import. If this is just for reporting rule, I think it's the over calculation of emissions or the over attribution of imports through the EIM is okay. But as several of us have pointed out, we do not yet know whether there will be a compliance obligation on EIM entities because of emissions associated with EIM imports. And if there is a compliance obligation, I think treating all purchases as imports overstates the quantity of imports and overstates the quantity of emissions and thus overstates the compliance obligation for those imports. So I'd like to know where this interpretation is coming from. Thank you.
Sure. Our interpretation of this comes from a reading of the regulation and in conversations with ecology. Bill, I don't know if you want to kind of opine here in terms of your regulation and the intent.
This is Bill. Can you hear me this time?
Yes.
Okay. Might have been better if just kept me muted. I can't really. I think as most folks know, I can't really opine on the full on the full issue, of course, until as clear out until the regulation comes out. I think I will. This is a nuance that actually I think want to thank California ISO for pointing out the essence of this issue, as I understand it, and as I think I at least personally agree with, is sort of a language issue. Claire, you're correct. There's that overall definition of imported electricity, but there's also the specificity in the EIM portion of that imported energy clause, which and Anya, please clarify if I'm getting this wrong, which I think California ISO has pointed out basically says that all the energy from the energy imbalance market will be treated as imported energy, sort of period. And so there's a that creates a situation where for electrical energy generated in the state of Washington, which in-state generation, there's it basically just creates kind of a language issue there, because you've got, as you said, you've got the overall clause, then you've got the specificity in the EIM subclause of that part, which basically says all EIM power is imported energy. And I think Cal ISO is really focused on that subclause. So that's the essence of the issue here. And Anya, correct me if I'm misinterpreting sort of that interpretation or that issue.
That was our interpretation, but again, this is all subject to the reporting rulemaking and clarification in that language. So.
It looks like we do have someone else in the queue as well. Caller, you can go ahead if you have a question.
Great. Thanks, Anya. It's Rob Campbell from PowerX. I have two questions. One is, would you mind flipping back to page 8? Super. So, and I think you said this in the white paper, but I just want to clarify. So I think one of the things that we're saying here is that, and I think you're pointing out in the white paper as well as here, is that generators inside the state will have a GHG compliance cost, and that generation outside the state that comes in through the EIM will not have a compliance cost associated with the imports. Is that right? And so I think it's fair to say that of the 3 ways that you can get energy to load within Washington state, one, generation will have a compliance cost. Imports, bilateral imports, will have a compliance cost, but import through the EIM will not have a compliance cost. Is there any way to track whether or not imports through the EIM, what's the periodicity that you're thinking about doing this reporting? Just, we've been quite concerned about leakage through the EIM in various forms, as you know. How often are you going to publish this data, or how are we going to know if that kind of extra opening in the regulation, in sense, extra imports through the EIM? Do you have any sort of approaches to that?
Yeah, we do have quarterly reports that we publish on some of that transfer information. And Rob, is your real question, what will the impact of not having a means for outside entities to reflect the cost of compliance and serving Washington, how will that impact transfers into Washington?
I wasn't as worried about that. I mean, I don't think that it's hard to speculate on what that will do, of course, and it sounds like the regulation's not set up to be able to point to an individual in terms of that set of incentives, or individual companies in terms of that set of incentives. I was mostly just interested in what your proposed reporting timeline was to be able to understand if that was happening.
So reporting is specifically developing reports for WEIM entities to report to the Department of Ecology. So they're reporting on an annual basis. But are you suggesting an additional type of reporting to reflect kind of the fact that, on day one, there is a requirement from Washington to include kind of a greenhouse gas cost of compliance, but the reporting rules don't have that same language around outside entities needing to do that?
I think it's mostly just, it might be worthwhile considering from ecology's perspective, just having a set of reporting, if this is the approach, reporting frequency that is reasonably high at the outset of the program. So you can see how the underlying electricity market is changing.
Okay, that might be an issue we defer to ecology on,
Yeah.
just in terms of.
And then I just had one more question. Can you flip to slide 14? Can I just ask, is this all transactions? Is this both, within the EIM? Is this from an entity perspective, is this a kind of a gross purchases to serve load, or is this a net? So if an entity has both generation that gets dispatched within the EIM and load that gets served within the EIM, are you netting those two, or are you just looking at the load side?
My understanding is it's the latter, it's the netting. James, did you want to opine here at all? It's the latter, Rob, but let me know if you.
And so maybe I'll just do a follow-on question for that. You talk about it in your slides. When you have a deemed delivery where the generation inside Washington State is deemed delivered to California, so just as an example, yeah, go ahead.
There's no deeming or attribution.
So if we had say a hydro plant in Washington State that was being deemed delivered to California, would, think about it this way, if you had 100 megawatt generation, 100 megawatts of load, notionally those are balanced, but that 100 megawatts of generation was deemed delivered to California, would this calculation show no imports, or would it show 100 megawatts of imports? Just deeming, no physical exports.
So when you say deeming, are you referring to kind of the process of attributing resources to another entity or another GHG region?
Yeah, within the EIM.
All right, and while there will be kind of resources that are attributed to California, there will not be any kind of attribution to Washington. So can you repeat the question? I just want to make it clear that.
If we have, it's just a simple question. If an entity is, if an EIM participating entity is essentially doesn't have any imports or exports into their balancing authority, but they're deemed, if there's under the California, if they're deemed delivered to California for the generation, my question is, would that show up as, in this calculation, would that show up as no imported electricity or 100 megawatts of imported electricity?
I mean, it would show up as 100 megawatts of generation within Washington.
Right. So, okay. So it would show up as no imports for this calculation.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
No more questions in the queue.
Okay. I believe that leads us to our next steps. So as mentioned at the beginning of the call, We are still targeting the October 25th and 26th Board of Governors meeting with an early 2023 implementation. We will be taking comments on the draft final proposal up until October 7th, so we will be publishing the comments template to the initiative webpage later today. And then we are also planning to post draft tariff language the week of October 11th. So here again is the comment deadline and a direct link to the initiative webpage where we will be posting the comments template. And then on this initiative webpage, you will also find the presentation that we discussed today along with the draft final proposal. And then my last reminders for today, if you have not registered already for the 2022 Stakeholder Symposium, we are holding it this year at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento. It is our first symposium in 4 years, so we're very excited to be able to host it again. It will be on November 9th and 10th this year, so if you have not registered, you can do so by going to the ISO website, and then under the Stay Informed tab, you'll see Stakeholder Symposium. So you'll click that and it'll take you out to our symposium webpage. And on that page, you will also see that we do have sponsorship opportunities available. So if your organization is interested in sponsoring the event, you can learn more about the different sponsorship packages that we have on that Stakeholder Symposium webpage under the Sponsors tab. So I'll open it up here for any last questions before we conclude. Okay, not seeing any. So thank you all for joining us today. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and we will be publishing that comments template later today. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for today's call. Thank you for using Event Services. Your call has ended and you may disconnect.